June 9th, 1941. The Western Desert, 15 miles southwest of Tobruk. Oberleutnant Franz Staudiger crouched in the cramped turret of his Panzer III Aus FG, sweat dripping down his face despite the early morning hour. The temperature inside the tank already exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. Through his vision blocks, he watched a British Matilda II lumber across the ridgeline 800 metres distant, its silhouette unmistakable against the pale desert sky. He'd been warned about these monsters. Every German tanker in North Africa had heard the stories. The Queen of the Desert, they called it. Impervious. Unstoppable. Staudiger gave the order. His gunner, Unteroffizier Klaus Hartmann, already had the Matilda in his sights. The 50mm KWK 38 L42 gun roared. Through his optics, Hartmann watched the armour-piercing round strike the Matilda's frontal glacis dead centre. A bright flash, then nothing. The British tank kept coming. Not even a pause, not even a wobble. The shell had simply bounced off. Hartmann fired again. Same result. A spark, a ricochet, the distinctive whine of hardened steel deflecting off even harder armour. The Matilda's turret began to traverse, its 2-pounder gun seeking its tormentor. Staudiger screamed into his throat microphone. Reverse. Full reverse. Now. This is the story of one of the most lopsided technological matchups of the Second World War. A story of German tankers discovering that their main battle tank, the Panzer III, could not harm the enemy in front of them. A story of British tank crews sitting virtually invulnerable while enemy shells bounced harmlessly off their armour. A story about what happens when engineering philosophy meets battlefield reality, and when the mathematics of armour penetration spell the difference between survival and annihilation. The Matilda II infantry tank Mark II was born from the painful lessons of 1918. British military doctrine in the interwar years divided tanks into two distinct categories. Cruiser tanks, fast and lightly armoured, would exploit breakthroughs and engage enemy armour. Infantry tanks, heavily armoured and slow, would accompany foot soldiers in deliberate attacks against fortified positions. The Matilda II, designated A-12, represented the pinnacle of infantry tank philosophy. Development began in 1936 at the Royal Arsenal Woolwich. The specifications were uncompromising. The tank must be immune to the standard 37mm anti-tank guns that equipped most European armies. It must be able to pace infantry at walking speed, roughly 8 miles per hour. It must carry a gun capable of engaging enemy bunkers and light armour. Weight was not a primary concern. Speed was not a primary concern. Survivability was everything. What emerged from the Vulcan foundry in 1938 was a 27-ton fortress on tracks. The Matildas II featured armour that shocked military observers when its specifications became known. The front glacis plate was 78mm thick. 78mm. For context, the German Panzer III that would face it carried 30mm of frontal armour, later upgraded to 50mm. The Panzer IV carried 50mm. Even the Soviet T-34, considered revolutionary for its time, had 45mm of frontal armour, albeit sloped at 60 degrees. The Matilda's turret was a single-piece cast steel unit, 75mm thick all around. The sides were 65 to 70mm. The rear was 55mm. Only the top and bottom at 20mm offered any vulnerability. The armour quality itself was exceptional. British armour plate designated IT.80 to IT. 100 represented some of the finest homogeneous steel produced anywhere in the world. The casting process for the turret, while expensive and time-consuming, eliminated weak points that plagued riveted or welded construction. The Matilda's armament was more modest. It carried the Ordnance QF 2-pounder, a 40mm gun with excellent armour-piercing capability for its size. At 500 yards, the 2-pounder could penetrate 42mm of vertical armour. Against the Panzer III's 30mm side armour, or the Panzer IV's unarmoured sides, it was devastating. A coaxial Beza machine gun, a British licence-built version of the excellent Czechoslovak ZB-53, provided anti-infantry capability. The Matilda carried 93 rounds of 40mm ammunition and 2,125 rounds for the machine gun. The crew of 4, commander, gunner, loader and driver, had adequate space, excellent visibility for the period, and the benefit of knowing that very little the enemy possessed could harm them. but the Matilda paid a price for its protection. Power came from two AEC diesel engines, essentially bus engines mounted side by side, producing a combined 190 horsepower. Later models used twin Leyland diesels generating similar power. 27 tons pushed by 190 horsepower meant the Matilda could achieve 15 miles per hour on roads under ideal conditions. Cross-country, especially in soft sand, it struggled to manage 6 miles per hour. The suspension, based on a Vickers design from the 1920s, used 5 double-wheel bogies per side with coil springs. While reliable, it was not designed for speed. The Matilda was not built to race across the battlefield. It was built to absorb punishment and keep moving forward. The Panzer III, meanwhile, represented an entirely different design philosophy. Development began in the early 1930s under Heinz Guderian specifications. Germany was rearming in secret, circumventing the Treaty of Versailles. Guderian envisioned a medium tank that would serve as the backbone of the panzer divisions. It must be fast enough for mobile warfare. It must have a 3-man turret, allowing the commander to command rather than also serve as gunner or loader. It must carry a gun capable of defeating enemy tanks, and it must be produced in large numbers. The Daimler-Benz design that emerged in 1936 met most of these requirements. The Panzer III ASF through C were experimental. Models produced in small numbers to refine the design. The ASF D, E, F and G models that entered mass production from 1938 onward represented mature fighting vehicles. The Panzer III weighed 19.5 tons in its early models, rising to 22 tons with additional armour. Power came from a Maybach HL 120 TRM engine, a 12-cylinder gasoline unit producing 300 horsepower. This gave the Panzer III a road speed of 42 km per hour, 26 miles per hour, nearly twice that of the Matilda. Cross-country performance was excellent thanks to a torsion bar suspension that provided good mobility over rough terrain. The crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver and radio operator/hull machine gunner, worked in a relatively spacious fighting compartment. The turret had excellent traverse mechanisms, both manual and hydraulic, and good visibility through quality optics. Communication equipment was superior to most contemporaries. The Panzer III was designed for the fluid, fast-paced armoured warfare that Guderian had theorised. But the original armament was inadequate. The first Panzer IIIs carried the 3.7 cm Kellerk 36L45, a 37mm gun that was essentially the same weapon as the towed Pak-36 anti-tank gun. Guderian and other senior officers had argued for a 50mm gun from the start. They were overruled on grounds of standardization and logistics. The Pak-36 was in widespread service. Using the same ammunition would simplify supply. The decision would prove costly. The 37mm gun could fire armour-piercing rounds that penetrated 34mm of 30-degree sloped armour at 100 metres. At 500 metres, penetration dropped to 29mm. At 1,000 metres, just 22mm. Against the light tanks and thinly armoured vehicles that made up most armies in 1939 and early 1940, this was adequate. Against a tank with 78mm of frontal armour, it was worse than useless. It gave the crew false hope. They could see the target. They could hit the target, but they could not harm the target. The inadequacy became apparent immediately. May 21, 1940, near Arras, France. The German Blitzkrieg had swept through the Low Countries and northern France with stunning success. Panzer divisions had reached the English Channel, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and large French formations. But the advance had created a vulnerable salient. The armoured spearheads had outrun their infantry support. Supply lines stretched thin. The flanks were exposed. The British counterattack at Arras was modest in scale but ambitious in intent. Major General Harold Franklin's force consisted of elements of the 50th Infantry Division, the 1st Army Tank Brigade, and supporting units. The Tank Brigade fielded 58 Matilda IS, 2-man vehicles armed only with machine guns, and 16 Matilda IIs with their 2-pounder guns. 74 tanks total. Against this, the 7th Panzer Division, under General Major Erwin Rommel, deployed over 200 panzers including Panzer, Es, Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs and captured Czech 38 Zeonts. The British advanced in 2 columns. The left column, 4th Royal Tank Regiment, with 35 Matilda IS, the right column, 7th Royal Tank Regiment, with 23 Matilda Is and 16 Matilda Ascends. At 2:30 p.m. on May 21st, they struck. The initial contact occurred near the village of Duisson. German infantry from the 6th and 7th Rifle Regiments, supported by the standard 37mm Pak 36 anti-tank guns, found themselves facing armour they could not penetrate. The Pak 36 crews did everything right. They waited for optimal range, they aimed for weak points, they fired and reloaded with practiced efficiency. The results were catastrophic for the Germans. Brigadier Douglas Pratt, commanding the 1st Army Tank Brigade, later wrote in a letter describing the battle, "None of their anti-tank weapons penetrated our Maquis or Tues. One Matilda had 14 direct hits from 37mm guns, and it had no harmful effect, just gouged out a bit of armour. The German anti-tank gunners, after firing a few rounds, bolted and left their guns, even when fired on at ranges of 600 to 800 yards. Some surrendered, others feigned dead on the ground. The German infantry, trained and confident veterans of the Polish and French campaigns, panicked. They had never encountered an enemy they could not harm. Their weapons, which had worked perfectly well against Polish 7TPs and French Renault R35s, were useless. Then the Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks arrived to counterattack. The Panzer IIs and Czech 38TDs, armed with 20mm automatic cannons, were even more ineffective than the Pak 36. Their shells bounced off harmlessly, often ricocheting into the sky with distinctive bright flashes. The Panzer IIIs with 37mm guns fared no better. Commanders watched in disbelief as their shells struck dead centre on Matilda hulls and simply bounced away. The Panzer IV, armed with a short-barrelled 75mm gun designed for indirect fire support, had only high explosive ammunition, no armour-piercing rounds. The HE shells caused superficial damage but could not penetrate. Rommel himself was nearly caught in the chaos. He drove south from Whaley to discover what was holding up his rifle regiments, and found himself in the midst of the British attack. Enemy tank fire had created chaos and confusion among our troops in the village, he later wrote. It was an extremely tight spot. Rommel did what Rommel always did. He improvised. He rounded up every available weapon that might harm the Matildas, artillery pieces that could fire in direct mode, and crucially the 88mm Flak 18 anti-aircraft guns, the famous 88s. These high-velocity weapons, designed to reach bombers at altitude, had the muzzle velocity and shell weight to defeat heavy armour. At close range, the 88mm gun could penetrate over 100mm of armour. Against the Matilda's 78mm, it was effective, though hardly guaranteed. Rommel personally supervised the establishment of a gun line. Artillery pieces, 105mm field howitzers firing over open sights. 88mm flak guns depressed to ground level. Every weapon that could engage ground targets, the line held, barely. The Matildas, unsupported by infantry who could not keep pace, and lacking radios in many cases making coordination impossible, pushed forward until they ran into the concentrated fire. Some were stopped, some were damaged, some simply ran out of fuel or ammunition. Of the 74 tanks that attacked, 46 were lost. But the impact on German planning was immense. Rommel reported being attacked by hundreds of tanks and 5 divisions. In reality, it was 2 depleted tank regiments. The psychological shock of facing invulnerable armour caused German commanders, including Hitler himself, to order the temporary halt that contributed to the Dunkirk evacuation succeeding. But Arras was just the preview. The real demonstration of Matilda invincibility came in North Africa, against the Italians, and then against the first German forces to arrive in theatre, September 1940. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani's Italian 10th Army invaded Egypt from Libya. The advance was ponderous and half-hearted. Mussolini demanded action. Graziani, understanding his forces were inadequately equipped and trained, complied reluctantly. The Italians advanced 60 miles into Egypt and established fortified camps around Sidi Barrani. There they stopped, to Mussolini's fury and Churchill's relief. The Western Desert Force under Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor prepared a counterattack. Operation Compass was planned as a 5-day raid to disrupt the Italian positions and then withdraw. It turned into one of the most lopsided victories in military history. The WDF had approximately 31,000 men. The Italians had 150,000. But the WDF had 48 Matilda II tanks of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment. The Italians had L3 tankettes, two-man vehicles with machine guns and armour measured in millimetres. They had M11 39 medium tanks, 11-ton vehicles with a 37mm gun in a hull mount, making it incapable of all-around fire, and 30mm of frontal armour. Against Matildas, they might as well have been unarmed. December 9, 1940, 7 a.m. The attack on Nibewa camp. The Italian artillery had been conducting what appeared to be another harassment bombardment from the east since 5 a.m. At 7, 48 Matilda tanks appeared from the northwest, from the undefended side of the camp. The Raggruppamento Maletti Group, an ad hoc formation of 2,500 Libyan troops and 35 M11 39 tanks, was caught completely off guard. Most crews were not even in their vehicles. General Pietro Maletti himself emerged from his dugout with a machine gun and fired at the approaching Matildas before he was killed. Brave, futile, and suicidal. The Italian tanks, those that were manned, fired at point-blank range. Their 37mm guns, identical to the German Pak-36, had the same effect. None. Not one Matilda was penetrated by tank fire at Nibewa. Italian artillery pieces firing over open sights scored numerous hits. Some Matildas had a dozen impacts on their armour. The shells gouged the surface, creating bright scars in the steel, but did not penetrate. The Italian gun crews fought with desperate courage. They died at their guns, firing until the Matildas crushed the weapons under their tracks, or machine-gunned the crews. The camp fell in less than 3 hours. The Maletti Group ceased to exist. The British captured 4,000 prisoners and destroyed 35 tanks for the loss of exactly 0 Matilda tanks. Some had damaged tracks from near misses, some had scratched paint, none were knocked out by enemy fire. The pattern repeated at Tumma East and Tumma West, at Sidi Barrani itself. The Italian troops, many of them colonial Libyan forces who had little stake in Mussolini's war, surrendered en masse when they realised their weapons were ineffective. An Italian army doctor, captured at Bardia, later wrote about encountering a Matilda. It was the nearest thing to hell I ever saw. Nothing we had could stop it. Our shells just bounced off. It kept coming and coming. Men threw down their weapons and ran. At Bardia, on January 3rd, 1941, 23 Matildas led the Australian 6th Division's assault on the fortified port. The Italians had prepared extensive defences, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, concrete pillboxes, and 400 guns. The garrison numbered 45,000 men. The Matildas punched through the defences in the first hours. They crossed the anti-tank ditch where engineers had filled it in. They crushed barbed wire under their tracks. They sat in front of pillboxes, immune to fire, and methodically destroyed them with their 2-pounder guns. Italian tanks attempted counterattacks and were destroyed. Italian artillery fired until they ran out of ammunition or were overrun. By January 5th, Bardia had fallen. 36,000 prisoners, 400 guns, 129 tanks. The Australians lost 130 men. The Matildas, working with infantry, who could consolidate the ground gained, were unstoppable. By February 1941, when Operation Compass concluded, the British had captured 138,000 Italian and Libyan prisoners, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, captured hundreds of tanks and over 1,000 guns, and advanced 500 miles. The Matilda's reputation was secure, the queen of the desert, the tank that could not be killed. But the easy victories against Italian equipment masked a growing problem. The Matilda could survive anything, but it could not kill everything. The 2-pounder gun, excellent against light armour, lacked a high explosive round. Despite one being designed, it was never issued. This meant the Matilda could not effectively engage anti-tank guns or infantry in fortified positions unless it could achieve a direct hit. The tank was also painfully slow, especially in soft desert sand where speeds dropped to walking pace. It overheated regularly. The steering, using a complex clutch and brake system, was difficult and exhausting for the driver. And most critically, the turret ring, the diameter of the rotating platform on which the turret sat, was only 54 inches. This meant upgrading to a more powerful gun would require designing an entirely new turret, perhaps an entirely new tank. These limitations didn't matter against the Italians, they mattered very much when the Germans arrived. February 12, 1941. General Lieutenant Erwin Rommel landed in Tripoli with the first units of the Afrika Korps. Hitler had sent a blocking force to prevent total Italian collapse in North Africa. That blocking force would turn into one of the most successful campaigns of the war. Rommel brought Panzer III's and Panzer IV's. Critically, many of his Panzer III's were newer models. The ASF F, G and H variants now carried the 50mm KWK-38 L42 gun. After the shock of encountering heavy French tanks like the Char B1 and British Matildas at Arras, German ordnance had finally authorised the gun Guderian wanted from the start. The 50mm KK-38 L42 was a significant improvement over the 37mm. At 100 metres, it could penetrate 55mm of 30-degree sloped armour. At 500 metres, 46mm. At 1,000 metres, 36mm. This was enough to defeat most Allied tanks frontally at normal combat ranges. The cruiser tanks that made up the bulk of British armoured formations carried 30 to 40mm of armour. The American M3 Stuart light tank had 38mm. Even the M3 Grant medium tank, which would arrive in early 1942, had 50mm at best. But against the Matilda's 78mm, the 50mm gun was still inadequate. At point-blank range, perhaps. At any normal combat distance, no. The mathematics were unforgiving. The Matilda's frontal glacis, at 78mm, was beyond the penetration capability of the 50mm gun at any range. The turret at 75mm was similarly immune. Only the sides, at 65 to 70mm, offered a theoretical possibility of penetration at very close range with ideal conditions. German tankers in North Africa quickly learned what their comrades in France had discovered. If you saw a Matilda, and it saw you, and you were in a Panzer III, you had one option. Disengage immediately. Run. The doctrine was formalised. Official German tactics for engaging Matilda d'Assaut, as documented in captured training materials, emphasised avoiding direct combat whenever possible. If engagement was unavoidable, the Panzer III should manoeuvre to get side or rear shots at close range. If flanking was impossible, the tank should suppress the Matilda with fire, not to destroy it but to keep it buttoned up, while heavier weapons were brought forward. The 88mm flak gun remained the primary counter to Matildas. Also effective were the 50mm PaK-38 towed anti-tank gun, which had higher muzzle velocity than the tank-mounted version, and the 75mm PaK-40, which would arrive in late 1941. But the Matilda's dominance was time-limited, not because German tanks became more capable, though they did. The Panzer III SFJ, introduced in spring 1942, carried the 50mm KWK-39L60, a longer-barreled version that could penetrate 67mm at 100 metres and 57mm at 500 metres. This was just barely adequate against Matilda sides at close range. The real threat came from German anti-tank guns. The arrival of more 88mm guns in Africa, the deployment of the PaK-38 in larger numbers, and especially the PaK-40 with its 75mm high-velocity gun, all these could defeat the Matilda at reasonable ranges. But more fundamentally, the Matilda was obsolescent by 1942 because it could not be effectively upgraded. The British desperately needed a tank that could mount the new 6-pounder 57mm gun. This weapon could penetrate 70mm of armour at 1,000 metres. It was essential for engaging the improved German tanks arriving in theatre. The Matilda's turret ring would not accept it. One experimental installation was attempted, using a turret from a Crusader tank. It proved impractical. The Matilda would have to soldier on with its 2-pounder gun, increasingly inadequate, while newer tanks took over the main combat role. The last major use of Matildas in the tank role in North Africa came during the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942. By then, they were a liability as much as an asset. Still largely immune to frontal fire from Panzer III's, they were vulnerable to the growing numbers of PaK-40 guns, to the long 75mm guns on late-model Panzer IV's, and to the increasing effectiveness of German combined arms tactics using coordinated anti-tank screens. More critically, their inability to fight back effectively against dug-in positions and their glacial speed made them frustrating to employ. After Alamein, the Matildas were withdrawn from frontline tank service, with British forces in North Africa. Some were converted to specialised roles. Matilda Scorpions carried mine flails for clearing paths through minefields. Matilda CDLs Canal Defence Light variants, mounted powerful searchlights for night operations, though they saw limited use. But the Matilda story wasn't over. Australian forces in the Pacific Theatre used them throughout the war, extensively modified for jungle fighting. Against Japanese armour, typically light tanks with 25mm or less of protection, and against Japanese anti-tank guns, typically 37mm or 47mm weapons, the Matilda was once again invulnerable. Australian crews added armour plates to protect the turret ring, the one vulnerable spot. They mounted infantry telephones on the back so soldiers could communicate with the crew without exposing themselves. They fitted flamethrowers, bulldozer blades, and additional machine guns. The Matilda served in New Guinea, Borneo, and the Solomon Islands, providing crucial infantry, support in terrain where its slow speed was less of a disadvantage, and its armour was still proof against anything the Japanese fielded. The last combat use of British-built Matildas came in 1945, making it one of the few tanks to serve from the first day of the war to the last. The Panzer III, meanwhile, continued to evolve. By 1942, the writing was on the wall. Even the improved L-60 gun was marginal against increasing Allied armour. The T-34, which German forces encountered in vast numbers on the Eastern Front, had 45mm of armour sloped at 60 degrees, making it effectively equivalent to 90mm of vertical armour against kinetic rounds. The KV-1 heavy tank had 75mm all around and weighed 47 tons. Against these, the Panzer III was hopelessly outclassed. The Panzer IV, with its larger turret ring, could be upgunned to the 75mm Kedekainse 40 L43 and later L48, giving it adequate performance. The Panzer III could not. In 1942, the final tank variant appeared, the Panzer III Ausweiss N. This carried a low-velocity 75mm gun, the same weapon as early Panzer IVs, for infantry support. It was an admission that the Panzer III could no longer serve as a main battle tank. Production of gun-armed Panzer IIIs ceased in 1943, but the chassis lived on. The Stug 3 assault gun, mounting a 75mm gun in a fixed superstructure, became one of the most successful German armoured vehicles of the war. Over 10,000 were built. The Panzer III's reliable chassis, good mobility, and ease of production made it ideal as a platform for assault guns and tank destroyers, even after it was obsolete as a turreted tank. The story of the Matilda and Panzer III is ultimately about design philosophy and the cruel mathematics of armour and gun performance. The Matilda represented British infantry tank doctrine taken to its logical extreme: maximum protection, adequate firepower, speed irrelevant. It succeeded brilliantly in its designed role, supporting infantry in deliberate attacks against fortified positions. Against Italian forces in 1940 and 1941, it was devastatingly effective, but it could not adapt. The small turret ring meant it could not be upgraded. The slow speed meant it could not exploit breakthroughs. The lack of HE ammunition meant it was less effective than it should have been. When the nature of desert warfare shifted to fast-moving battles between armoured formations, the Matilda was a relic. The Panzer III represented German mobile warfare doctrine: balanced design, good mobility, three-man turret for command and control, upgradable weapons. It succeeded well enough against most opponents, but revealed a critical flaw: initial armament was inadequate. When it finally received a proper gun, that gun was already becoming marginal. The Panzer III was adaptable enough to remain useful longer than the Matilda, but ultimately it too was overtaken by the arms race between guns and armour. There were individual encounters, recorded in war diaries and after-action reports, that capture the experience of both sides. A Panzer III commander in North Africa, whose name is lost to history, described an encounter near Tobruk in May 1941. We saw the Matilda at perhaps 700 metres. My gunner was good. He hit it 3 times. All 3 times the shell bounced off. I could see the sparks through the binoculars. The Matilda stopped, turned its turret toward us, and fired once. The round went through our front plate like it wasn't there. It killed my driver instantly. We bailed out. When we looked back, the Matilda was just sitting there, waiting. We hadn't hurt it at all. A British Matilda commander, Lieutenant James Holman of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, described the flip side. The German tanks would fire and fire and fire. You'd hear the hits, bang, 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 like someone throwing rocks at a steel shed. We'd just sit there and take it. Then we'd traverse, take our time aiming and shoot once. Usually that was enough. Their armour couldn't take what ours could give. But God help you if you threw a track or broke down. If you couldn't move, eventually they'd get the 88s up, and then you were done. The technological reality was stark. From mid-1940 through mid-1942, a Matilda II could engage a Panzer III with confidence of victory. The Matilda could survive any hit from the Panzer III's gun. The Panzer III could not survive hits from the Matilda's 2-pounder. This remained true even after the Panzer III upgraded to the 50mm gun. Only the arrival of the long 50mm in early 1942, and then only at close range against side armour, gave the Panzer III a fighting chance. And even then, the mathematics favoured the British tank. But technological superiority without tactical flexibility is limited in value. The Matilda could not be everywhere. It could not pursue. It could not exploit. In the fluid warfare of the Western Desert, where battles could range over hundreds of square miles, being invulnerable but slow was less useful than being fast enough to choose when and where to fight. The faster Crusader cruiser tanks, despite thinner armour, could manoeuvre to favourable positions. The M3 Grant, arriving in 1942, combined reasonable armour with a powerful 75mm gun and good speed. The M4 Sherman, arriving in late 1942, offered an even better balanced package. The Matilda gradually faded from the front lines, not because it could be defeated, it largely couldn't be, but because it could no longer contribute effectively to the kind of warfare being fought. By 1943, tank battles in North Africa involved long-range gunnery duels between tanks with 75mm and larger guns, shooting at ranges of 1,000 to 2,000 metres. The Matilda, with its 2-pounder and limited ammunition capacity, was irrelevant at those ranges. It could survive, yes, but it could not fight back effectively. For the German tankers who faced Matildas, the experience was traumatic. Every aspect of their training emphasised aggressive action. Close with the enemy, achieve fire superiority, destroy the target. Against Matildas, none of that worked. Closing with the enemy meant getting into range of that 2-pounder gun, which could punch through your armour while yours bounced off theirs. Achieving fire superiority was impossible when your shells had no effect. Destroying the target was not an option, unless you could get rear or flank shots at close range. And the Matilda, despite being slow, was usually well supported by faster tanks and infantry. The psychological impact paralleled the technical reality. German combat reports from North Africa in 1941 and early 1942 repeatedly mention the fear Matildas inspired. One report from a Panzer III platoon commander noted that when Matildas were reported in an area, crews became noticeably more cautious. Men who would aggressively pursue other British tanks became defensive when facing Matildas. This wasn't cowardice, it was rational calculation. You could shoot at a Matilda all day and achieve nothing except giving away your position and wasting ammunition. Meanwhile, if it hit you once, you were finished. The British tankers, for their part, understood they had a temporary advantage. They knew the 88s were coming. They knew the Pak 40 was arriving. They knew their gun was becoming obsolete. A Matilda II's gunner wrote home in late 1941, "Jerry's scared of us, and rightly so. His tanks can't touch us, but his anti-tank guns are getting better. We've lost chaps to those bloody 88s. You hear that crack, and you know someone's brew is brewing. We joke that we're in land battleships, but even battleships sink if they're hit right. We're just hoping the war ends before Jerry builds something that can pen us reliably." The encounters between Matilda and Panzer III, when they occurred, were brief and one-sided. In every documented case where a Matilda II engaged a Panzer III and both tanks were fully operational, the Matilda won. Sometimes the Panzer III crew could disengage before being hit. Sometimes they couldn't. But they could not win the direct fight. The only Matilda losses to Panzer IIIs came when the German tank achieved side or rear shots at very close range, typically less than 200 metres, against the thinner armour, or when a Matilda was immobilised by mines or mechanical failure, and a Panzer III could carefully aim for weak points like vision blocks or the turret ring. These were the exceptions. The rule was simple. Matilda beats Panzer III. Matilda beats Panzer III with 50mm gun. Matilda beats nearly everything the Germans fielded until guns larger than 75mm became common in the theatre. Production numbers tell part of the story. The British built 2,987 Matilda IIs between 1938 and 1943. This included various submarks with different engines and minor modifications. It was never intended to be produced in huge numbers. Infantry tanks were expensive and time-consuming to build. The Germans built approximately 5,174 Panzer IIIs of all variants. The Panzer III was intended as the backbone of the Panzer divisions and was produced in much larger quantities than the Matilda. Yet on a one-to-one basis, the Matilda was decisively superior until mid-1942. The cost differential was significant. A Matilda's total cost approximately £6,000 to produce, roughly $24,000 in 1940 exchange rates. A Panzer III cost approximately 96,000 Reichsmarks, roughly $38,000. The Matilda was cheaper to build and far more survivable, but it could not be upgraded, and that ultimately doomed it as a frontline weapon. The Matilda's armour scheme deserves deeper analysis because it explains why it was so effective. Most tanks of the era used vertical or near-vertical armour. This maximised internal space and simplified production. But it meant that armour-piercing rounds struck perpendicular to the surface, the ideal angle for penetration. The Matilda used vertical armour too, but it compensated through sheer thickness. 78mm was an enormous amount of protection for 1940. For comparison, the Panzer VI Tiger Western, introduced in late 1942 and considered heavily armoured, had 100mm of frontal armour. The Matilda, 2 years earlier and 27 tons lighter, had 78mm. The quality of British armour plate was also exceptional. Homogeneous armour plate with careful heat treatment produced steel that was both hard and tough. Hard enough to shatter penetrating rounds, tough enough not to crack or spall excessively when struck. Many German tank crews reported that even when they hit Matildas, there was no visible damage, no cracks, no spalling on the inside, just a scar on the surface and perhaps a bright spot where the shell struck. The ballistic cap on German armour-piercing rounds was designed to prevent shattering on impact with face-hardened armour. Against homogeneous armour, the cap sometimes caused the round to lose energy without achieving penetration. The result was shells that hit hard, gouged the surface, and then bounced away without penetrating. This was psychologically devastating to the crews firing at them. The Panzer III's armour, by contrast, was adequate for 1940 but quickly became marginal. 30mm of frontal armour on early models, 50mm on later variants with appliqué plates or redesigned front plates. This was enough to defeat rifle-caliber machine guns, light cannon and infantry anti-tank weapons. It was not enough to defeat the 2-pounder gun at any range. The British weapon, firing a 2.4-pound projectile at 2,715 feet per second, could penetrate the Panzer III's frontal armour at over 1,000 yards. Side and rear armour, typically 30mm, could be penetrated at even longer ranges. The Panzer III crew had to avoid being hit. The Matilda crew just had to avoid track damage. This fundamental asymmetry defined every engagement. The Germans tried various solutions, adding spaced armour plates, to trigger shaped charges prematurely, though this wasn't common until later in the war against weapons like the bazooka, coating tanks with Zimmerit paste to prevent magnetic mines, welding additional armour plates to critical areas. None of this helped against kinetic armour-piercing rounds. You could add 20mm of additional plate to a Panzer III's front, bringing it to 70mm total on late models. It still wasn't enough against the larger guns that were arriving, and it made the tanks slower and more mechanically stressed. The operational differences mattered as much as the technical ones. A Matilda regiment typically had 50 tanks organised into 3 squadrons. Each squadron had a headquarters and 3 troops of tanks. The regiment also had a headquarters squadron with command tanks and reconnaissance elements. This was a substantial combat formation. When 50 Matildas attacked in coordination, supported by infantry and artillery, they were nearly unstoppable. But those 50 tanks required a logistics tale of staggering proportions. Each Matilda consumed fuel at an alarming rate. The twin engines, working hard to push 27 tons, burned through diesel reserves quickly. In soft sand, fuel consumption could reach 2 gallons per mile. A road march of 50 miles could empty the fuel tanks. Each tank needed constant maintenance. The complex steering mechanism required frequent adjustment. The tracks wore quickly in abrasive desert sand. The engines overheated regularly, requiring cooling system maintenance. A Matilda regiment in the field needed hundreds of support personnel, dozens of trucks carrying fuel, ammunition and spare parts, and forward repair facilities to handle the inevitable mechanical breakdowns. The Panzer III was more reliable mechanically. The Maybach engine, while less powerful than needed, was robust. The torsion bar suspension required less maintenance than the Matilda's complex coil spring bogies. German logistics doctrine emphasized forward repair, with recovery vehicles that could quickly evacuate damaged tanks to field workshops. But the Panzer III had its own challenges. Gasoline was more volatile than diesel, increasing fire risk. Parts commonality with other panzers helped, but supply lines across the Mediterranean were vulnerable. By 1942, fuel shortages in North Africa were chronic for the Afrika Korps. The tactical employment of Matildas evolved as their limitations became clear. Early doctrine treated them as nearly invulnerable breakthrough weapons. They would lead assaults, absorbing fire while infantry followed behind. This worked well against Italian forces and in set-piece battles where the slow speed wasn't a disadvantage. As German anti-tank capabilities improved, Matilda tactics became more cautious. They were used as mobile strongpoints, positioned in defensive lines where their armour could blunt German attacks. They provided fire support for infantry assaults, but from positions where they could be quickly withdrawn if 8.8s or PaK-40s appeared. By late 1942, Matilda commanders understood they were operating on borrowed time. The advantage was slipping away. The Panzer III's tactical role also evolved. Initially intended as the primary tank-killing platform in German formations, by 1942 it was increasingly relegated to supporting roles. Panzer IVs with long 75mm guns took over as the primary anti-tank weapon. Panzer IIIs with the short 75mm gun provided infantry support. Even in this role, they remained useful. The mobility and reliability of the platform meant it could keep up with rapid advances and contribute to combined arms operations, even if it couldn't defeat heavy enemy tanks. The human experience of crewing these machines deserves consideration. A Matilda crew lived in a cramped hot steel box that was immune to most enemy fire, but could kill them through heat exhaustion, mechanical failure, or the occasional hit from a heavy weapon. The commander stood in the turret, head and shoulders exposed when not buttoned up, directing the driver through intercom and giving firing commands to the gunner. The gunner sat on the right side of the turret, eye pressed to the telescope, operating the traverse and elevation controls. The loader sat on the left, pulling 40mm rounds from the racks and slamming them into the breech. Each round weighed about 5 pounds. The loader would handle hundreds during a long engagement. The driver sat in the hull, peering through a narrow vision slit, wrestling with the steering levers that required significant strength to operate. All 4 men sweated profusely in the heat. Temperatures inside a Matilda in the desert could exceed 60 degrees Celsius, 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The noise was constant and deafening. Twin diesel engines roaring, tracks clattering, radio crackling. The gun firing made ears ring even with padded helmets, but they felt relatively safe. Rounds hitting the armour made loud bangs but rarely penetrated. The crew knew their tank could take punishment. A Panzer III crew had a somewhat larger fighting compartment but far less peace of mind. 5 men, commander in the turret, head out of the cupola when possible, directing operations and maintaining situational awareness. Gunner on the right, operating a well-designed gun sight and firing controls. Loader on the left, handling 50mm rounds that weighed about 4.5 pounds each. Driver in the front left hull, using the excellent transmission and steering system. Radio operator in the front right hull, managing communications and firing the hull machine gun. The gasoline engine was quieter than the Matilda's diesels, but posed a greater fire risk. The crew compartment was better ventilated. The optics were arguably superior, but the crew knew that if a 2-pounder round hit them, it was coming through. The armour would not save them. They relied on not being hit. Mobility, situational awareness, engaging from favourable positions. If they could see the enemy first, manoeuvre for a flank shot, or disengage before taking fire, they could survive. If they blundered into close-range combat with a Matilda, they were probably going to die. These psychological factors influence behaviour in combat. British Matilda crews could afford to be aggressive, charge into enemy positions, sit in the open trading fire, take risks. Their armour was their shield. German Panzer III crews facing Matildas had to be cautious. Use terrain for cover, keep distance, manoeuvre constantly, call for heavier weapons. Their survivability depended on tactics, not armour. The stress levels were markedly different. This isn't to say British tankers didn't face fear and stress. They absolutely did. Mines were terrifying. Breakdowns left you immobilized and vulnerable. The 8.8s could kill you. But in a straight-up tank duel with a Panzer III, they had overwhelming advantage. The Germans knew it. The British knew it. And knowing you have a decisive advantage is psychologically empowering, while knowing your weapons are ineffective is demoralizing. The intelligence assessments from both sides reflect these realities. British intelligence reports on the Panzer III from 1941 note that it is a well-designed tank with good mobility and adequate firepower against most targets. Reports specifically mention that the 50mm gun is insufficient against Matilda armour at normal combat ranges. One report notes that captured Panzer III crews express frustration at their inability to harm Matildas and fear when encountering them. German intelligence reports on the Matilda from the same period are more alarming in tone. One report from the Afrika Korps in May 1941 states that the Matilda's II infantry tank is virtually immune to all weapons currently available to tank and anti-tank units. Penetration can only be achieved by 88mm flak or heavy artillery at close range. Engagement by Panzer III tanks is not recommended unless flank or rear shots are possible. The assessment is clinical, but the implications are clear. The standard German tank cannot fight the British heavy tank on equal terms. By 1943, both tanks were obsolete as frontline weapons. The Matilda soldiered on in secondary roles and in the Pacific. The Panzer III transitioned to assault gun and tank destroyer variants, but the story of their encounters remains one of the most interesting in armoured warfare history. For a period of roughly 2 years, one of the combatants possessed a weapon the other could not effectively counter. The Matilda was not invincible. Mines, mechanical failure, heavy anti-tank guns and artillery all posed threats. But in direct tank versus tank combat, it was as close to invincible as any armoured vehicle has been. The Panzer III was not helpless. Its mobility, reliability and tactical flexibility made it a valuable combat vehicle throughout its service life. But against the specific threat of the Matilda II, it was outmatched. The crews on both sides understood this reality, and that understanding, more than any technical specification, defined how these encounters played out. The story concludes not with a single dramatic battle, but with a gradual obsolescence. By mid-1943, neither tank was a decisive factor in its theatre. Newer, better tanks had arrived. The Sherman, the T-34, the Panther, the Tiger, the arms race continued. But for a brief period in the Western Desert, German tankers looked at British Matildas and knew their shells would bounce, and British tankers looked at Panzer IIIs and knew they could win. That asymmetry, that imbalance, shaped battles and saved or cost lives. The mathematics of armour and penetration are ultimately about human survival. Every millimetre of thickness, every metre per second of muzzle velocity. These abstract numbers determined who lived and who died in those steel boxes rolling across the sand. When the Panzer III met the Matilda II, the mathematics were not in Germany's favour. The shells bounced. The Matilda kept coming, and the crew inside, sweating and deafened but alive, knew they had the better machine, at least for a while. The tide turned gradually, then all at once. Spring 1942. The German arms industry, spurred by reports from North Africa and the catastrophic encounters with Soviet heavy tanks on the Eastern Front, accelerated development of more powerful weapons. The 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun began arriving in Libya in meaningful numbers by March 1942. With a muzzle velocity of 790 meters per second and firing a 6.8 kilogram armor-piercing round, it could penetrate 98mm of vertical armor at 500 meters. Against the Matilda's 78mm, it was finally adequate. Not overwhelming, but adequate. For the first time, German anti-tank units had a weapon that could reliably defeat Matildas at reasonable combat ranges without requiring the increasingly scarce 88mm flak guns. The Panzer IV also transformed during this period. The OSF F2, later redesignated OSF-G, mounted the long-barreled 75mm KWK 40L43 gun. This weapon could penetrate 89mm of armour at 500 meters, rising to 96mm with improved ammunition. The Panzer IV, previously relegated to infantry support with its short 75mm gun, suddenly became Germany's most effective tank destroyer in North Africa. It could defeat Matildas frontally at combat ranges. More importantly, it could defeat the newer Grant and Sherman tanks that were arriving with British and American forces. The balance had shifted, but perhaps nothing demonstrated the changing nature of tank warfare more clearly than the arrival of the M3 Grant medium tank in early 1942. The Grant was an awkward design, born from American urgency to field anything, that could fight German armour. It mounted a 75mm gun in a sponson on the right side of the hull, limiting traverse, and a 37mm gun in a fully rotating turret. It weighed 27 tons, the same as the Matilda, but it could travel at 26 miles per hour on roads, nearly twice the Matilda's speed, and that 75mm gun, firing a 6.8 kilogram round at 620 meters per second, could penetrate 60 millimeters of armour at 1,000 meters. Against Panzer III and early Panzer IV armour, it was devastating. The Grant didn't make the Matilda obsolete through superior protection. The Grant's armour maxed out at 57mm on the frontal hull, less than the Matilda's 78. What made the Grant superior was the combination of adequate armour, significantly better mobility, and a gun that could actually harm the targets it faced. The 2-pounder, despite being an excellent armour-piercing weapon, simply couldn't deliver the weight of shell needed for modern tank combat. The 75mm gun could. When British units received their first Grants in time for the Gazala battles of May 1942, tank commanders who'd spent years in Matildas or cruiser tanks suddenly had a weapon that could stand and trade fire with German armour at range. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Miller commanded a Grant squadron during the Gazala fighting. He'd previously served in Matildas. His assessment, written in a letter to his wife in June 1942, captured the transition. The old Matildas were grand when Jerry had nothing that could hurt them, but they're too slow now, and that 2-pounder is useless against anything but light stuff. The Grant is ugly as sin, and the 75 can only traverse about 30 degrees, which means you have to turn the whole bloody tank to aim properly. But you can actually hurt the German tanks with it, and you can keep up with the battle. I'll take awkward and effective over invincible and slow. The Battle of Gazala, May 26th to June 21st, 1942, marked a turning point. Rommel's Africa Corps, now equipped with substantial numbers of Panzer IIIs with the long 50mm gun, Panzer IVs with the long 75, and critically dozens of Pak 40 anti-tank guns, faced British forces that included Matildas, Grants, and various cruiser tanks. The Matildas performed as expected. They could still shrug off fire from Panzer IIIs, they could still contribute in infantry support roles, but the Germans had learned. They established integrated defensive positions with Pak 40s covering likely approach routes. They used Panzer IVs as mobile anti-tank weapons, engaging British armour at ranges where the superior German optics and gun performance made the difference. One engagement, documented in the war diary of the 32nd Army Tank Brigade, illustrates the new reality. On May 28th, a squadron of Matildas supporting the 150th Brigade Box came under fire from dug-in positions. The Matildas advanced, absorbing hits from Panzer III guns as expected. Then the Pak 40s opened fire. The first Matilda took a hit to the lower glacis and caught fire. The crew bailed out. The second took a round through the turret face at a slightly oblique angle. 3 crew, killed instantly. The remaining tanks halted, called for artillery support, and withdrew under smoke. The invincible tank had met weapons that could kill it. The psychological impact was immediate. Matilda crews who'd operated with confidence, even arrogance, now approached German positions with caution. The armour that had saved them for 2 years was no longer a guarantee. By the time of the Second Battle of El Alamein, in October 1942, the Matilda's frontline service was effectively over. The battle saw massive concentrations of armour. Montgomery's 8th Army fielded over 1,000 tanks, including 285 Shermans, 246 Grants, 421 cruiser tanks of various types, and just 194 Matildas and Valentines. The Matildas and Valentines, both infantry tanks with heavy armour and inadequate guns, were relegated to supporting roles. They helped clear minefields with flail attachments. They provided close infantry support in areas where German anti-tank guns had been suppressed. They were not used for the armoured thrust that broke through the Axis lines. That role went to Shermans and Grants and the faster cruiser tanks. The Sherman, arriving in late 1942, rendered the Matilda completely obsolete for the British. The M4 Sherman weighed 30 tons, carried 51 to 76 millimeters of frontal armour depending on variant and angle, mounted a 75 millimeter gun, could travel at 25 to 30 miles per hour, and was mechanically reliable. It wasn't as heavily armoured as the Matilda. A determined Panzer III could penetrate a Sherman's armour at close range with the long 50 millimeter gun. But the Sherman could shoot back effectively, could manoeuvre rapidly, could be produced in enormous numbers, and could be upgraded with better guns and thicker armour. The Sherman represented balanced design philosophy. Not perfect at anything, but adequate at everything. The Matilda represented specialised design taken to an extreme. Perfect at one thing, protection, but inflexible and increasingly inadequate at everything else. The Panzer III faced a similar obsolescence, driven by the same factors. On the Eastern Front, encounters with T-34s and KV-1s made it painfully clear that the Panzer III was no longer adequate as a main battle tank. The T-34, with its sloped 45mm armour, its 76.2mm gun, its wide tracks for mobility, and its diesel engine, represented a leap forward in tank design. The Panzer III couldn't reliably penetrate a T-34 frontally beyond very close range, even with the long 50mm gun. The T-34 could penetrate the Panzer III at any combat range. The asymmetry that German tankers had briefly enjoyed against light Allied tanks in Poland and France had reversed. Now they were on the receiving end. German industry responded with the Panzerkivor upgrade, the Panther and the Tiger. The Panzer III was retained in diminishing numbers for specific roles and increasingly converted to other purposes. The most successful conversion was the Sturmgeschütz III, the Stugi III assault gun. By mounting a 75mm gun in a fixed superstructure with limited traverse, designers created a low-profile, heavily armoured vehicle that was cheaper and faster to produce than a turreted tank. The Stug III served in infantry support and tank destroyer roles throughout the war. Over 500 were built on Panzer III chassis, making it Germany's most produced armoured fighting vehicle. The basic Panzer III design, the hull and suspension and automotive components, was sound. It was the turreted tank configuration, with its limitations on gun size, that became obsolete. Production figures tell the story of declining relevance. Matilda's second production peaked in 1941 with 330 units built. In 1942, just 827 were produced. In 1943, production ended after 10 units, likely vehicles already under construction. Total production reached 2,187 tanks. Panzer III production peaked earlier, in 1941 with 969 units. By 1942, production had dropped to 1907 units, as resources shifted to Panzer IV, Panther, and Tiger production. In 1943, just 264 Panzer IIIs were completed before production of the gun-armed variants ceased. Total production of all Panzer III variants reached approximately 5,174 vehicles. The survivors of these machines, the crews who'd fought in them, carried mixed memories. British veterans who'd served in Matildas spoke with genuine affection for the old tanks. They'd saved lives. Men who would have died in thinner armoured tanks survived because the Matilda could absorb punishment. But they also acknowledged the frustrations, the mechanical unreliability, the exhausting heat, the maddening slowness, and increasingly the helpless feeling of having armour but no effective weapon. A Matilda gunner, interviewed decades after the war, remembered engaging German positions in early 1942. We'd sit there, shells bouncing off, feeling safe as houses, but we couldn't do much damage back. The 2-pounder was fine against trucks and light vehicles, against proper anti-tank guns and bunkers. Unless you could hit exactly right, you were just making noise, and Jerry learned to just let us sit there while he brought up the 88s or the Pak 40s. Then we'd have to scarper. Not much use being invincible if you can't hurt the enemy. German veterans of Panzer IIIs told different stories. Many spoke highly of the tank's mechanical reliability, good mobility, and excellent crew layout. The 3-man turret was repeatedly cited as a major advantage, allowing the commander to focus on commanding while the gunner and loader handled the weapon. But North Africa veterans almost universally mentioned the terror of facing Matildas in the early period. One veteran, interviewed in the 1970s, was blunt. The Matilda was our nightmare in 41. You'd hit it dead centre and watch your shell bounce away. Then you'd see that turret turn toward you, and you knew you had maybe seconds to reverse behind cover or you were dead. I lost friends to Matildas. Good men. Good crews, they did everything right. But their shells just bounced off and then the Matilda shot once and it was over. The technical evolution continued after both tanks left frontline service, but in different directions. British tank design moved away from the infantry tank concept entirely. The Churchill, the final British infantry tank, entered service in 1941 with heavy armour, but also with a decent gun and better speed than the Matilda. By 1944, British armoured divisions fielded Shermans, Cromwells and eventually Comets. All were cruiser-type tanks with balanced protection, firepower and mobility. The infantry tank doctrine, the specialised heavy tank meant purely for supporting foot soldiers, was quietly abandoned. It had been proven inadequate for modern warfare. German tank design went in multiple directions. Heavy tanks like the Tiger and King Tiger emphasised firepower and protection at the cost of mobility and mechanical complexity. Medium tanks like the Panther attempted to balance sloped armour, powerful guns and reasonable mobility. Assault guns and tank destroyers like the Panzer III and Panzer IV provided cost-effective anti-tank capability. But all of them carried guns of at least 75mm. The era of 37mm and 50mm tank guns was over. The arms race had moved to a new level. In the Pacific theatre, however, the Matilda enjoyed an extended service life precisely because the arms race had not reached the same level. Japanese armour doctrine emphasised light tanks for infantry support and reconnaissance. The Type 95 Heigo light tank, the most common Japanese tank, weighed 7.4 tons and carried 12mm of armour. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank weighed 15 tons with 25mm of frontal armour. Against these, the Matilda was ludicrously overprotective. Japanese anti-tank weapons were similarly inadequate. The Type 94 37mm anti-tank gun was essentially identical to the weapons that had failed against Matildas in North Africa. The Type 1 47mm anti-tank gun, introduced later in the war, could theoretically penetrate the Matilda's side armour at close range, but was never available in large numbers. Australian infantry in New Guinea, Borneo, and the Solomon Islands found the Matilda ideal for their needs. The jungle terrain limited mobility anyway. Roads were poor or non-existent. Combat ranges were often under 100 metres. The Matilda's heavy armour made it nearly immune to Japanese weapons. Its 2-pounder gun, inadequate against German armour, was perfectly sufficient against Japanese light tanks and bunkers, and the tank's reliability, properly maintained, was acceptable for the pace of Pacific Island campaigns. Australian crews added practical modifications. External telephone so infantry could communicate with the crew without exposing themselves. Additional armour plates welded over vulnerable spots. Extra machine guns for anti-infantry work. Some were fitted with flamethrowers. For bunker-clearing operations, the Matilda Frog, an Australian flamethrower variant, served extensively in the Borneo campaign of 1945. The flamethrower replaced the 2-pounder gun with fuel tanks installed in the hull. Range was limited to about 80 metres, but in jungle terrain that was adequate. Japanese bunkers, which could hold up infantry for hours or days, could be neutralised in minutes by a Matilda Frog. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was extreme. A flamethrower tank that could not be harmed by their weapons was a weapon without counter. Australian after-action reports note that Japanese positions often surrendered or fled when Matilda Frogs approached, without the flamethrower even being used. The final combat use of Matilda Cs came in July 1945 during the Battle of Balikpapan in Borneo. Australian forces, supported by Matilda tanks, assaulted heavily fortified Japanese positions. The Matildas, largely immune to Japanese fire, provided crucial support that allowed infantry to advance with acceptable casualties. By this point, the war in Europe had been over for 2 months. The Matilda, designed in 1936, was still doing the job it had been built for, supporting infantry in deliberate attacks against fortified positions. It just took 9 years and a different theatre for the job to remain relevant that long. The Panzer III's final evolution, the Stug III, also served to the war's end and beyond. Sturmgeschütz units fought on every front where German forces operated. The combination of low-profile, heavy frontal armour, eventually increased to 80mm, and the powerful 75mm gun made it an effective tank destroyer and infantry support vehicle. Compared to turreted tanks, the Stuka III was cheaper, faster to produce, and easier to maintain. Its limitations, primarily the fixed gun requiring the entire vehicle to traverse to aim, were acceptable given its defensive role. Dozens of Stuka IIIs were captured by Soviet, American and British forces and pressed into service. After the war, Syria and other nations operated Stuka IIIs into the 1950s and 1960s. The Panzer III chassis, if not the Panzer III tank, had remarkable longevity. Looking back, the Matilda versus Panzer III matchup represents a specific moment in armoured warfare evolution. For approximately 2 years, from mid-1940 to mid-1942, a technological imbalance existed that strongly favoured the British tank. This wasn't due to British tanks being universally superior. British cruiser tanks were often inferior to their German counterparts in armament, reliability and design integration. But the Matilda, in its specific role, was superior to anything the Germans fielded in the tank category. Not assault guns, not towed anti-tank weapons, not artillery, but tanks specifically. The Panzer III could not defeat the Matilda in direct combat during this period. The imbalance ended not because the Panzer III improved enough to match the Matilda, though it did improve somewhat. It ended because the nature of tank warfare evolved beyond both vehicles. Guns became more powerful, armour became thicker or better sloped. Tanks became heavier and more complex. The T-34, Sherman, Panther and Tiger represented a new generation where compromises between mobility, protection and firepower were managed differently. The Matilda's absolute prioritization of protection and the Panzer III's balance, weighted toward mobility, both became outdated approaches, yet the human element, the experience of the men who fought in these machines, remained constant. They lived in cramped, hot, dangerous steel boxes. They relied on their crewmates absolutely. They knew that mechanical failure, bad luck, or enemy skill could kill them regardless of their tank's capabilities. But they also knew, in those brief encounters when Matilda met Panzer III, who had the advantage. One could hurt the other could not hurt back. That knowledge shaped how they fought, how they manoeuvred, how they felt about their chances of survival. War is ultimately about individuals making life and death decisions with imperfect information and inadequate tools. Sometimes the tools are adequate, sometimes they're superior. Sometimes, as German Panzer III crews discovered in the Western Desert, your tools are simply insufficient for the task at hand. The bouncing shells, the scarred armour showing no penetration, the slow traverse of the Matilda's turret as it targeted the German tank that could not harm it, the panic of reversing at full speed, hoping to get behind cover before that 2-pounder fired. These are the specific visceral details of what it meant when armour thickness exceeded gun penetration capability. Mathematics translated into survival or death. The Matilda II and Panzer III, locked in their brief unequal combat, demonstrated this truth more clearly than almost any other matchup of the war. And then, as the war ground on and new weapons arrived, both became relics. The Matilda retired to secondary theatres and specialised roles. The Panzer III transformed into assault guns or was scrapped for parts. The survivors, a handful in museums today, sit silent. The crews who fought in them are nearly all gone now, but the story remains, a case study in how technological advantage is temporary, how specialised design becomes limitation, and how the arithmetic of armour and penetration determined who lived and who died in humanity's largest and most terrible war.